In this tutorial, we will look at how to use for loops in Python. In the previous tutorial, we looked at something called the while loop, and we could use a while loop to basically test a condition, and while the condition was evaluating to true, we could keep repeating a block of code. And for loops are another type of repetition structure where we can repeat blocks of code or statements in our code, but we can use a counter to or a range to repeat that code a set number of times. So for loops are useful when we want to repeat code a certain number of times, and also useful for going through things like lists. So going through each individual item in a list, and that's something that we'll look at later. And also, for example, going through each letter or each character in a string. So they're very useful, and we'll only look at some of the basic uses of for loops in this tutorial, and in the rest of this series we'll be using for loops a lot, looking at other ways that they can be used. So for example, using loops to go through items in lists. So they're very useful. For loops are used a lot in Python programming, but we're just going to get started with some of the basics in for loops today. So to start with, when you create a for loop, you use the keyword for. And in this particular example, I'm going to use a for loop to repeat a statement of code 10 times, exactly 10 times. So with the for loop, you use the keyword for, and then you use a name that's going to be representing the counter in the loop. And quite often that's I. Okay, so I will represent each iteration of this loop. So the value of I will increase every time this loop runs. Okay, so it will start from 0 and increase by 1 each time. So I'm going to say I want this loop to run 10 times. So I'll say for I in range, and then in brackets I specify a number that represents how many times I want this loop to repeat. Now, to start with, make that 10. What this means is that I'm going to run this loop 10 times. So for I in range 10 means we're going to run this loop 10 times. Now, there's a bit more information that I can provide in these brackets, but that's just what we're going to start with. Now, I end that line with a colon, and now my code that is indented to the right underneath this for statement here is going to run in the loop. So I could do something simple like just printing a message 10 times. So I could print hello 10 times. So save and run that. And we see the output here is hello printed 10 times on the screen. Okay, but the thing about for loops is they have a built-in counter, which is quite useful. So this I here, I can use that as well. I can print the values of the counter and see it increase each iteration of the loop. So this time I'm printing the value of I, and you'll notice it starts from 0 and stops at 9. Now, our loop basically was said repeat this code 10 times, but rather than counting from 1 to 10, it's counted from 0 to 9. That's important. Basically, in Python and in many programming languages, there's a thing called indexing which starts from 0. So that means things like items in a list. If you have maybe a list of words, each word in that list will be represented by an index or its position in the list. And same with things like string variables. If we have a variable that contains a string of text, each individual character in that string will have a position or an index, and it always starts from 0. So we count or index from 0 in Python. Now, that will be important, and we'll look at that a little bit more later. But let's say we didn't want to start from 0 and go to 9. Let's say we did want to go exactly from 1 to 10. Well, we can actually add another parameter here. So we can say 1, comma. So what this means, if we have two values here separated by commas, is this means that it means that the first value is where we start counting from, and the second value is where we want to stop counting to. Now the thing is, it's not inclusive of 10. So what this means is it's actually going to print from the numbers, or go through the loop from numbers 1 to 9. So if we actually want it to get to 10, we need to add 1 on here. So say 1, 11, save and run that. And now we see that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it starts counting from 1 all the way up to the number before 11, which is 10. Okay, and we're just printing out those values there. Now, using our for loop here, we've specified a range from 1 to 10, but we can also add a third parameter here, so we can add another comma, and the third parameter is our increment. So how much do we want to increase I by every time this loop runs? So let's say we wanted to count by 2. So we want I to increase by 2 every time. Saving that and running that, we'll see that we get 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Okay, and we could do that with 3 as well and test that. And we get 1, 4, 7, 10. So here we have our starting number, our stopping number, and our increment amount. Okay, so that's basically how a for loop works, where we have a built-in counter that we can use. And here we've just used this example. We've used this for loop to either run a block or statement of code a certain number of times, or in this case, we've actually used the counter in a print statement here to actually see what the value of the counter is. But for loops are much more useful than just repeating code a certain number of times. We can actually go through different things. So we can go through string variables. We can go through each character in a string. We could go through every item in a list one by one and process those items. There's lots of different things that we can do with for loops. I'm going to do a couple of those things today. So what I'm going to do here, so I'll just delete this code, and I'm going to make a string variable. It's just going to be called word, and I'll make the word hello. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this string here, or go through this word, and I want to print each letter on an individual line. Okay, so I can use a for loop, and I could say for I in, and then use the word variable, so I can go through each individual letter in the word. But because I'm going through each letter, I can actually just call my counter, or what's going to represent each letter in this string, or each character in this string. I can just call it letter. So I can say for letter in word, which basically means for each letter in this word, every time when this loop runs, every time it repeats, letter is going to represent the next letter. So it'll start with H, and next time the loop repeats, it will be E, and then L, and so on. Okay, so say for letter in word, print letter. All right, now if we save and run that, we should see each individual letter on a new line. And there we go, H-E-L-L-O. Okay, now this is slightly different to the way that we used our for loop a moment ago. When we were working with a range of numbers, we said for I in range, and then specified a range. So either how many times we wanted to repeat the loop, or range between two particular numbers, and an increment, things like that. But here it's slightly different. We've used our counter here, but we've said in word, so we've actually just mentioned the variable that we created earlier, and Python automatically knows that we want to go through each character here in this string. But what if we wanted to also use a counter in some way? So maybe we just wanted to print out every second letter in the word, or something like that. Well, we're going to need to get the index of each character in this string. So Remember, I said counting or indexing in Python and many other languages starts from 0. And that means with things like strings, like this string here, our word variable, which contains the string hello, each value in this string, each individual character, is represented by an index or position. And remember that that starts from 0. So H is indexed at 0, E is 1, L is 2, this L is 3, and this O is indexed at 4. So we can use these indexes in a for loop. If we, for example, wanted to maybe capitalize every second letter or display every third letter or something like that. So let's try that out. And we need to adjust this for loop slightly. So this time what we're going to say is for I in, and again we can call I whatever we want. We could call it letter, or we could give it a completely different name if we wanted to, but it's quite often called I in programming. And remember that I is going to represent the index of each item or each character here that we go through in the string one by one every time the loop repeats. So we can say for I in range, similar to the syntax we initially wrote. And then we can say basically go through every character through the whole length of this word. So we can use the len or length. It's just len just means length. So we can use the len function to get the length of the word variable. In other words, the number of characters in our string called word. And we'll use that as our range. So there are 5 letters in this string here. So we're basically starting from 0 and counting all the way up to 4. So 0, I will be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 every time this loop runs, and we can use I to get each letter individually. Alright, so we say for I in range length word. Now what we'll do here, just to test it out, is we'll print I, so we'll see the index, and we'll also print out the letter represented by that index each time it increases. So we'll say print I, and then on the same line print word I in square brackets, and close it, brackets for the print statement. And what this will do, what this should do, is for the first time the loop runs, it will print I, which is initially 0, because we count from 0. And then it will also print word I, which means, and I in these square brackets means that we're going to use that index, which currently is 0, because the loop is running for the first time, which means print word character 0. So it's going to print out the character represented by index 0 in the word variable. And then the loop will repeat again, and so I will increase to 1, which means that it will print the value 1, and then word character 1, so E, and then so on all the way up to O. So let's save that and run this module. And here we go. So we've got 0, H, 1E, 2L, 3L, and 4O. So each line here is an iteration of this for loop, printing out both the index and the actual letter represented index. Okay, so going off what we did before, where we specified a range and then how much we wanted to increase the counter by each time, we can do the same thing here. So what we can say is for I in range 0 all the way up to the length of the word, which is 5 characters. But remember, we're counting from 0 to 4. So it's not going to get anything with an index of 5 because it only goes up to 4. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So basically from 0 to 4. And then we can add another comma at the end here and specify how much we want to increase this I counter by. So maybe by 2. And what this means is that we'll print out every second letter. So saving, running that. We see H, we skip the E, and we see L, skip the next L, and then O. Okay, so we see the counters here are going up by 2 each time, and every second letter is also skipped. Okay, so just before we wrap up for this tutorial, a few things that we've learnt here. We can use for loops to repeat code a certain number of times, but we can also use for loops to go through things like strings, and we'll go through lists. We'll look at that in another tutorial after we look at how to work with lists. But things in Python are also indexed. So things like strings, each character it has an index or position. Same with lists. Each item in a list has a position. So we can use the indexes to get particular parts of a string or particular items in a list. For example, if I cut this for loop here, and let's just say I want to get the third letter here in the string, which is L. I can just say print, and instead of saying print word to display the whole string, I can just put in square brackets after word the index of the letter that I want. So if I want the third letter, remember we count from 0, index from 0, so it would be 0, 1, 2. So the third letter would have an index of 2. So in the square brackets, you can put the index in, save and run the code, and we should just see the letter L displayed. Okay, so strings are basically a sequence of characters where each character in the string has an index or a position that we can refer to. And these indexes come in very handy when we're working with for loops. And that's why for loops are so great, because we can use the built-in counter for a for loop to refer to a specific item in a list or a specific character in a string. And because the counter is built into a for loop, there's also a smaller chance that we'll run into problems where we maybe count too high and we try to access something that doesn't exist in a string. So let's say we had a while loop and we had a counter variable that we create in the while loop or outside the while loop, and we increase that counter in the while loop. We might maybe increase in the wrong order, or something just hasn't been written right, and we might try and access, using indexing, we might try and access something that doesn't actually exist. Like, for example, we might try to access a letter in Word with index 5, which doesn't exist because it only counts up to 4. So for loops are very good for that reason. Anyway, that's it for this tutorial. We'll look at for loops much more in the future, especially when we start working with lists. Thanks for watching.